Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Accused War Criminal, an American Kempei Tai Survivor, by Fiske Hanley II, narrated by Joe Barrett. Foreword. I am happy and honored to say that I had a role in liberating American prisoners of war, including Fiske Hanley, the author of this book, who were being held by the Japanese at the time that hostilities between Allied forces and Japan ended on 15 August 1945, marking the end of World War II. Fiske had been a flight engineer on a B-29 flying the first mining mission to Japan's vital Shimonoseki Straits. It was on 27 March 1945 that his B-29 was shot down after the crew had dropped its mine load. Fiske was one of only 2 survivors of his B-29. His story of survival as a special prisoner while awaiting trial and execution as an accused war criminal documents the atrocities suffered by a special type of prisoner of the Japanese. Treatment of special prisoners imprisoned in dungeon cells of the murderous Kempei Tai is another example of Japanese inhumanity, much of which wasn't publicly known until years later. It was General Curtis LeMay's 20th Air Force that had brought the full fury of warfare to the Japanese homeland, hastening the war's end. The B-29 Superfortress War against the Japanese enemy did not last long, just a little more than a year. Its role was swift and deadly. The 504th Bomb Group under LeMay had the distinction of dropping the last weapon of World War II, a mine, on 15 August 1945, ending the hostilities of World War II. My assignment at that time was as Assistant Chief of Staff for Administration of the Central Fleet. I was under the command of Admiral William F. Halsey, and it was the duty of my section of the staff to prepare a plan to liberate the Japanese-held American prisoners. When the time came, Admiral Halsey approved our plan and said to Commander Roger Simpson and me, "Roger and Harold, these are our boys. Go get them." And so we did. Even though the hostilities had officially ended, there still was the matter of locating and liberating the American POWs. On 29 August 1945, major battle units of the U.S. Navy sailed into Tokyo Bay, which started 61 hours of non-stop liberation. The first camp liberated was Camp Omori, where American, Australian, Canadian, English, New Zealand, and Italian prisoners were held. It's also where prisoners in the Kempei Tai headquarters prison in Tokyo, such as Fiske, were transferred after the cessation of hostilities. This is a horror story that must be told. Harold E. Stassen. Preface. During the night of 27 March 1945, my B-29 crew and I were shot down while on a World War II bombing mission over Japan. It turns out I was one of only 2 survivors from our aircraft. Soon after reaching the ground after parachuting out, I was captured, imprisoned by the Japanese, and held as a special prisoner in a dungeon at Kempei Tai headquarters in Tokyo. This was a prison for American airmen accused of killing innocent civilians. We were not treated as POWs, we were treated worse. That's because we were accused American war criminals. As wards of the brutal Japanese Kempei Tai thought police, who were comparable to Hitler's SS and Gestapo, we were guarded by sadistic goons specially picked for their brutality. Special deadly rules applied to our imprisonment. As a captive B-29 crewman, I was to eventually be tried and executed, all without the ruling of a judge or jury. It had been preordained. I was on a different kind of death row, where prisoners did not simply await their execution date. They were roughed up, abused, starved, and otherwise horribly mistreated for months on end. Special prisoners had no way of knowing the total magnitude of Kempei-inflicted atrocities because we were kept isolated from one another during our imprisonment. Communication with other prisoners was prohibited. Violators could, and often would, be executed. Except for when we were locked in our cells, we were blindfolded and handcuffed. The only time we were taken out of our cells was to be interrogated and beaten. There was no reprieve, no safe zone to retreat to. From the date of my capture until 15 August 1945, I watched as fellow airmen were brutalized, tortured, starved, and murdered. Many eventually died from their battle injuries. Others were beaten to death or died of malnutrition. The few of us who survived were within a hair's breadth of death from starvation and disease when the war ended. As you might have surmised, special prisoners received no medical attention. We were considered subhumans by our Japanese captors and treated as animals. Special prisoners were denied soap, razor, toothbrush, comb, shoes, belt, bedding, and medicine. We never saw the sun. We were not allowed to exercise. There were no baths for us, and no changing out of our filthy, ragged, vermin-ridden clothing. That stuff wasn't permitted. We were put on a diet intended to starve us to death in a few months. Of those B-29 crewmen falling into the hands of Kempei Tai, fewer than half survived. Prisoner of war survival would have been zero had the Allies invaded the Japanese mainland. Imperial Japanese headquarters ordered that all prisoners were to be executed if and when their shores were invaded. Japanese people were ordered to fight to the death. The atomic bomb saved millions of lives, American and Japanese. Prisoners of war owed their lives to President Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb. It ended the war. I was one of the few fortunate survivors. God saved my life many times during my imprisonment. God protected me. Fisk Hanley. Chapter 1. What happened? Outside, the air was calm. There were no whitecaps on the waters below us, and our airplane was functioning smoothly. Everything was great. Shortly, it would be dark, but right now we were enjoying a great view of the sunset, one of the fringe benefits of flying over the beautiful Pacific Ocean. As the skies began to darken, I could see the many gauges on my flight engineer's instrument panel beginning to glow in the rays of the night lights playing over them. I could barely see Harlan Fintel, our navigator, sitting across the cabin from me. He was bent over his table, working on his navigational maps. At one point, Harlan, navigator, announced over the intercom that the island of Iwo Jima was showing up on his radar screen, and it was about 50 miles away. Small radar blips indicated there were hundreds of U.S. Navy ships surrounding the island. As we approached the island, many lights, tracers, and explosions could be seen. There was a war going on. John Brown, our commander, directed the radio operator to tune to Iwo Jima combat channels as we passed nearby. We listened to urgent and heart-rending communications between advancing, hard-fighting Marines and Navy Marine fighters buzzing over the island like mad hornets. The supporting fighters were being urgently ordered to direct machine gun fire and bombs to take out enemy strongpoint positions only a few feet from their advanced, precarious positions. After leaving the vicinity of Iwo, which was roughly halfway to our target, we continued to bore through the sky toward the Japanese mainland. As we approached the Japanese Empire, we began readying our personal protection gear for whatever danger we might encounter. Prior to takeoff, each of us had acquired some extra protection gear at our crew station. In my case, I had placed a small piece of flak curtain centered under my dinghy and a 2-foot square of curtain under my feet. Some crew members placed sections of flak curtain around their stations. The flak curtain could be compared to a bulletproof vest. It was made up of very hard steel with fabric around it. It wasn't very thick, maybe 1/8 of an inch, but it was really strong. When flak blows up, it breaks up into a bunch of fragments. I had a dinghy, a small one-man boat with oars that inflates when you pull the string after you've bailed, which acted as a cushion beneath me. The flak curtain was underneath me, too, so when the projectiles hit me, the flak curtain stopped most of it, but it wasn't big enough to keep some flak from hitting both of my hips in the soft flesh. In order to prepare for combat, we had removed our parachutes and put on, in order, a survival vest, a Mae West life jacket, and a flak vest. The Mae West jacket fits on the torso to protect the front and back. It's a flotation device. When you hit the water, you pull a little knob, and it inflates. We were well protected, and we could still move around fine in the airplane. When we stood up, we had the dinghy hanging from our rear end and attached to the harness of our parachute on our backs. There was a tunnel on the airplane to allow us to go back to the aft cabin if necessary, but you always left the parachute on. The cabin was pressurized, with a flight engineer in charge of how hot or cold it was inside the cabin. The plane's engines put out pressure, which supplied pressurized air to the cabin. We all wore the same things, so it was pretty easy to find one temperature that would be comfortable for all of us. Our final combat-ready procedure had been to strap the heavy flak helmet in place, and with that, we thought ourselves ready for whatever defenses the enemy might throw at us. We then checked to make sure our individual good luck charms were on duty. There's no leaving home without them. Much ingenuity and originality was displayed in choosing these important items. My good luck charm was an 1890 silver dollar that I carried in my pants watch pocket. Baxter Love had a small rabbit's foot on a string, which he tied above his head. Al Andrews attached a small red Santa Claus to the bulletproof glass in front of him. John Brown had his razor-sharp hunting knife. Other crewmen had personal good luck charms, which made for some lively discussions over the intercom. Each of us felt that if there were to be casualties on this mission, it wouldn't be one of us. It would happen to some other crew. We were concerned, but we never doubted that we would survive the required 35 combat missions and return home safely. The B-29 was quite an aircraft. Although there were plenty of bugs to be worked out when it first was put into service, there were a number of advancements that made it advantageous to the B-17. On the B-17, for instance, the guns were hand-operated. On the B-29, there were remote-control turrets with a computer in its own electric system. It was awesome. The gunner had a little gun sight that figured out how big the airplane, an enemy fighter, was, how far away it was, and that sort of thing, and it was very, very accurate. So that was rather complex. The airplane was pressurized, which was an unusual thing for that time. It was the first military plane to be pressurized. We could fly in shirt-sleeve comfort like airliners do today at high altitudes. So we learned about all of these things. It was very impressive. The B-29 was an experimental airplane that, due to war pressures, had been rushed into production. It had not been debugged. Eddie Allen, chief pilot for Boeing, had just crashed in one a few months before we got up to Seattle in February 1944. The engines caught on fire, they failed internally, and the systems malfunctioned. It was pretty sporting to fly, and that's what was designed and bought to bomb Japan from 1,500 miles away. The oddest feeling came over me during the last portion of the long flight to Japan. It wasn't the nervous churning in my gut. That was routine during this part of a mission, and it would stay that way until we left the target area. This time, though, seated at my perch, I got this impression that I was standing apart and studying myself seated at my flight engineer's station, illuminated by the dim lights of the instrument panel. How in the world had I gotten myself into this hellish situation? Me, Fisk Hanley. How and why was I in this peculiar place at this particular time? Why was I flying over the Pacific in a B-29? How did I get mixed up in this terrible war? A short time before, I had been a scholar, enjoying fraternity life and planning a great future. How had my life changed so drastically in such a short period? Was I really there? A love for aviation. I have been involved in the world of aviation all my life. My youth was consumed with my passion of designing, building, and flying model airplanes. When I was 6 years old, I got to ride in a Ford trimotor airplane out on a ranch my dad had taken me to. The plane was all aluminum, and it had 3 engines, one in the middle and one on each side. My fare was less than 50 cents, based on 1 cent per pound of passenger weight. We lived in Wichita Falls, Texas, until I was about 10 years old, so that's where I got my start in aviation. Every penny I earned I used to build model airplanes, and I built all shapes and sizes. That ride in the Ford trimotor airplane is what started my flying career. The pilot flew around and did a lot of interesting maneuvers for me. The models I built kept getting bigger and bigger until I started putting a gasoline motor on them and started winning many contests with model planes that had a 4-foot wingspan and went from there. Once I started going all over the state and winning more contests, I thought I would move on to national competition, and so I did. In high school, my gasoline-powered model airplane won the 1937 national contest sponsored by Texaco and held in July that year in Dearborn, Michigan, at the site of what is now Detroit Metro Airport. By now, 1937, I was 17 years old and decided for the national contest that I would build a plane with a 10-foot wingspan, bigger than anything I'd ever seen in Texas. There were 2 other local boys who were going to go. They put their smaller planes in the same shipping box with mine, and we had them shipped ahead to Dearborn. The 3 of us then drove up there together in an old beat-up car belonging to one of the other boys, and we took turns at the wheel. A guy called Bill Brown, who had built the motor for me, took special interest in my airplane and fine-tuned that small gasoline engine, which had a 4-minute run. So I started the engine and held a wingtip as it took off. It climbed and climbed until the engine cut out, being out of gas, and by then the airplane was about 2,000 feet in the air. A contest timer, a soldier, and my driver in the old beat-up car followed the airplane as it flew downwind. After the engine cut out, it just continued to glide. It was a hot summer day, and the thermal carried it over the city of Detroit, the Detroit River with its 3 channels, and into Canada. The plane eventually glided down and landed out in the river. It was a long way out there, so being quite eager to retrieve my plane, I rented a rowboat and rowed out there. Along came a motorboat with 3 fishermen, and they had my airplane. They had thought it was a real airplane when they first saw it come down. It did a belly landing, and it was okay. It was intact and still operable. We went to the award ceremony that night at some convention center, still not knowing who had won. It turned out that my plane was the prime champion, having flown for a total of 50 minutes and 29 seconds, setting a world record. It went 20 miles or so. It was just so amazing. I became semi-famous because of it. That plane has since been copied all over the world. My winning the contest was written up in a magazine, complete with specs and drawings of my airplane, showing its construction and engineering. It's a pretty airplane, and I built it complete with a cockpit and everything. I just believed I would win. I knew all these famous other plane builders who had flown their planes. I had seen what they had done, and I knew I could do better. After graduating from Pascal High School in Fort Worth, Texas in 1938, I earned an associate in science degree in aeroengineering from North Texas Agricultural College, NTAC. In 1943, I received a Bachelor of Science degree in mechanical engineering with an aeronautical option from Texas Technological College. Even though I had a 2-year associate's degree, it still took me 3 more years to get my bachelor's degree from Texas Tech because not all of my credits from NTAC transferred to Texas Tech. During my junior year at Texas Tech, the Texas Draft Board contacted me for military service. This was right after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, 7 December 1941. I had a date that Sunday, and I was driving around listening to the radio. I was driving my uncle's car when I heard about the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor and the war starting. So I was there at Tech in December 1941, and the draft had already started. Shortly thereafter, I got my draft notice from the Fort Worth Draft Board. I wrote them and told them that I was in school and all this, and I had even been interviewed for a job with Curtis Wright in Columbus, Ohio, and had a job with them, but that didn't impress the Draft Board. They had a quota, and they needed people, so they didn't give me any hope of finishing my schooling, and I went to the Army recruiting office in Lubbock. I had heard about the Aviation Cadet training program for engineers. I went down there and passed the physical. They said, "Okay, we will let you finish your schooling and graduate. Then you will be an aviation cadet in the Army Air Corps," as it was at that time. It became the Army Air Force in mid-1942, I think. So I was granted a deferment until my 1943 graduation. I neglected to say earlier that when I was trying to avoid being drafted, I had heard first about the V5 or the V6 program, where, when you graduated, and they allowed you to graduate, you got a direct commission in the Navy as an engineering officer. So I came down to Dallas, took a physical, and passed it. I went back to Lubbock thinking, man, I'm really good. I'm going to be in the Navy on a carrier or something. Not bad. It would probably be safe and so on. But when my papers got to the Naval Headquarters in New Orleans, I got a Dear John letter saying, "You are rejected." The reason I was rejected was because when I checked all of the things that you talked about, whether you had pneumonia and all that, I put down that I had an allergy, hay fever. The Navy rejected me based on my hay fever. Why, I don't know. That's why I immediately went to the Army recruiter. I picked the Navy first, and after that, with my educational specialty in aeronautical engineering, I figured I'd be an engineering officer. But it didn't work out that way. The Army recruiting office in Lubbock, Texas, was very efficient. I had a draft letter assigning me to a draft board to report on such and such date. On 31 May 1943, at 0800, less than 24 hours after my graduation ceremony, I reported to the Army recruiting office. I expected to be allowed a day or two to go home with my parents, who were in Lubbock for my graduation. I would gather my possessions, move them to Fort Worth, and once there, prepare for my Army service assignment. Well, forget those best-laid plans. Instead, I was handed my induction and shipping orders, a train ticket, and was told to be on a train that left in less than 2 hours. Working quickly, I sold or gave away most of my college gear and packed the rest into the family car, which I had borrowed for the previous night's graduation festivities. I asked the recruiting sergeant what I should do about getting the car to my parents, who were visiting relatives in a nearby town. Without concern, he said, "Oh, they'll find it." I quickly packed an extra shirt and my razor into a small bag that I had received as a graduation gift, left the car keys with the recruiting sergeant, and boarded the waiting train. My Army induction was so sudden that I was on the train before it dawned on me that I was no longer a civilian. I was a private in the Army Air Force. 13 hours after I had graduated, I was on my way to Boca Raton, Florida, for cadet basic training. Had I known how to read my orders, I would have known that I had 3 days' delay en route and could have returned to Fort Worth with my parents, visited for a day or two, and then entrained. I would also have learned that I had an adequate dollar per diem allowance. I had a big celebration the night before, and there was very little money left in my pocket for the 4-day trip. The train trip was anything but routine, for me at least. I had to make several train changes and deal with an overnight delay in New Orleans en route. It was also a very hungry trip for me. That recruiting sergeant who prepared my orders could have at least interpreted the Army mumbo-jumbo for me, but he didn't. I have always wondered if he felt some glee in putting one over on a college boy going off to become an officer. Cadet Training. A large Army truck was waiting for me upon my arrival in Boca Raton, with me as its only passenger. It delivered me to the luxurious Boca Raton Club, which the Army had requisitioned and converted into an aviation cadet basic training center for engineering, meteorological, and communication cadets. My orders read, "Report to the commanding officer." As I climbed off the truck, I was greeted by a smartly dressed cadet officer who informed me that he, not the CO, commanding officer, would process me into the cadet system. He barked orders at me to stand at attention, about face, and then he backward marched me, suitcase in hand, toward the cadet reception center. My one-man backward parade led me past about 600 cadets standing in ranks getting ready for the evening flag-lowering ceremony. The assembled cadets were all smiles as I marched by, and they shouted at me at the top of their lungs, "You'll be sorry!" I grinned back at them and was immediately ordered by the cadet officer to wipe it off. After my backward march to cadet headquarters, my rigid cadet discipline and induction procedure began. Due to wartime shortages, my one set of civilian clothes had to do for all activities until my Army-issued uniforms were obtained 2 weeks later. I looked unkempt and felt worse in Florida's stifling June heat. When an inspecting officer asked why I was dripping wet after a drill period, I told him that I was merely sweating. He quickly informed me that cadets do not sweat, cadets perspire. Don't ever forget that, Cadet Hanley. I also learned that there are only 3 acceptable answers to an upperclassman's question: yes, sir, no, sir, and no excuse, sir. Interestingly enough, when I headed down to Boca Raton, the cadets were about half college students and half carefully selected enlisted men. It was a superb mixture. There were a lot of blacks down there. Now, if you read history that says that blacks were mistreated in the cadet program, they were not mistreated. They were equal with us. There was no favoritism for anyone, and I was impressed with that. So we had about half enlisted men who knew their way around. They knew what a technical order was, and I didn't. It's a book that tells you how to do things, you know. I found out about that. So that was really good, because these people who came into the ranks were helping to teach us how the real world was out there. The cadet training regime began in earnest at 0600 each morning. From my 2 years of ROTC military training at North Texas, I'd learned a lot about Army discipline, marching, and handling a rifle. This training now came in handy. The 16-hour days were packed with Army basic subjects such as marching, calisthenics, firearms, survival, guard duty, Army laws, rules, and regulations, plus special training by upper-class cadets. On occasion, to test our stamina, we marched all night. We bivouacked in swampy and mosquito-ridden forests. We stood guard duty with real rifles and real bullets. Cadets were constantly under intense scrutiny. Anything and everything that was leather or metal had to be cleaned and shined daily. We militarized, GI'd, the beautiful club fixtures and floors by scrubbing and polishing them. Our shoes and brass insignia were shined at least twice a day, every day. Our bunk beds had to be made so tightly that a dropped quarter must bounce at least a foot above them. Demerits, gigs, were liberally passed out for minor infractions. Major infractions could lead to washing out of the cadet program. Too many gigs in the weekend would be ruined by disciplinary periods of marching around the club. Those who didn't measure up to the strict mental and physical standards were washed out. These unfortunates became instant privates or returned to their previous rank. Survivors were highly motivated to work harder to meet Air Force Aviation Cadet requirements and graduate as commissioned officers and gentlemen by act of Congress. These tests that we had were washing out cadets, as well as bad discipline or just not being all together, not being mentally alert, and all that. These engineering officers would ask questions. One of the questions I was asked was, "Okay, you're over in China, and you have a P-40 Curtiss Warhawk fighter. You have to change the engine, and all you have are wrenches and that sort of thing. How do you do that?" I told them, "Well, I'm in China." He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, I'd get my Chinese people, there are a lot of them, to start digging a slanted ditch down in the ground that would take the airplane so the engine would rest on the ground, right over there." Gesture. We'd unbolt it, slide it out of the way, and slide the new engine into place. This fellow said, "That's the first time I've ever heard that. They usually say get bamboo poles and put them together with ropes." I said, "Ropes break." I passed. Chuckle. Cadets training together developed an intense sense of comradeship and esprit de corps. We trained well together, and during our meager time off, we visited the nearby Florida towns of Del Rey, Fort Lauderdale, and Miami. This area of southeastern Florida was crowded with thousands of enlisted troops who mistakenly saluted us, thinking that we were officers because of our unique cadet insignia. We were delighted. This was a real morale builder, as usually our life and treatment as underclassmen was lower than a snake's belly. After 6 weeks as lowerclassmen, we achieved the lofty status of upperclassmen, and for 6 weeks life was much easier, with more privileges and the respect afforded us by the miserable lowerclassmen. We had hardly gotten used to the great feeling of upper-class superiority when we graduated from basic training and went to our technical training, where we started all over again as lowerclassmen in the cadet classification system. We were back at the bottom of the totem pole. Technical School. My cadet class graduated from Boca's basic training in early September 1943. From there, it was on to specialized training at technical school, to be held at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. We were now Ivy Leaguers. Well, sort of. At Yale, we were segregated into several cadet technical categories. My section was engineering, the other two were weather and communications, and it was housed in Lawrence Hall, one of Yale's oldest buildings. The welcoming upperclassmen made sure that we realized once again that we were the lowest form of humanity.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?